Hi, it's Mr. Ramage, and this video lesson is going to be a brief look at the Paris Peace Conference and focusing on President Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points. For the purposes of this video lesson, I'm going to be utilizing this standard from the state of Ohio. So the Paris Peace Conference takes place in January of 1919, a few months after the armistice goes into effect in November of 1918. And the Paris Peace Conference's goal is to develop a treaty to officially bring World War I to a close. Now, there are a number of countries represented at the Paris Peace Conference, but we're going to focus on what are called the Big Four. These four countries are going to come to dominate the conference and therefore dominate the treaty. Georges Clemenceau is representing the nation of France. Obviously, France had been invaded by Germany. The war had been predominantly fought on the Western Front in France for 4 years. France has lost a lot of its land, a lot of its industry, a lot of its infrastructure, and France has suffered significantly over the last 4 years. So we must understand that France is going to this conference hoping to punish and weaken Germany significantly and to protect France from future conflict. For the British, they're represented by Prime Minister David Lloyd George. The British are interested in protecting their empire, maintaining their dominance in world affairs, expanding their empire by seizing control of German colonies, and protecting its navy, which received significant damage during the war thanks to the German U-boats and the war zone that they created around the British Isles. The Italians are attending the conference looking for lands promised to them by England and France. At the beginning of the war, Italy was allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary, but switched sides during the course of the war to join the side of the Allied powers. Italy really wants to be considered as a major European power, but the British and the French don't exactly see it that way. And the fourth member of our Big Four is the American President Woodrow Wilson. Wilson attends the Paris Peace Conference rather than sending the Secretary of State or a delegation of other members of Congress or of the executive branch. Wilson goes there himself, and that's going to be an important part to understand. He believes that this is a very monumental part of American and world history. Wilson goes to Paris with what he calls his 14 points, Wilson's plan for peace now that the war is over. And his 14 points are designed to address issues that are going to hopefully prevent future wars and address the issues that have led to the start of World War I. Wilson is definitely going to Paris with the mindset that he is there to basically solve world war. If we take a look at Wilson's 14 points and just sort of summarize them, here are the things that are included. Wilson wants to abolish secret treaties. He wants to reduce military armaments around the world and essentially calling for international demilitarization. The 14 points also address the need to end colonial empires and provide self-determination to former colonies, instituting some form of republican government or democracy within these colonies. One of Wilson's biggest contentions during the war was the issue of freedom of the seas, and so he includes that in his 14 points and lists freedom of the seas for all nations as one of them. Also, having free trade amongst nations. And probably the most significant part of Wilson's 14 points, the one that he is going to support and talk about the most, is the establishment of an international peacekeeping body that he calls the League of Nations, which would resolve conflicts and work towards world peace, which would hopefully, if it had been in place, had averted the disaster that was World War I. Wilson said, "Nothing less depends upon this decision, nothing less than the liberation and salvation of the world." So Wilson sees the Paris Peace Conference as this moment in history where there are lots of possibilities and we have been challenged to make the right decision, that the fate of the world kind of depends on this. When Wilson arrives in France, he is well received by the French people. They come out in droves to celebrate and to thank President Wilson and the Americans for essentially rescuing and saving the French people. So as Wilson comes to Paris, he comes with this sort of mandate from the people, that the people of France support and love him. Viva Wilson is shouted and screamed at him. So Wilson feels extraordinarily confident as he arrives in France. But as the conference begins and develops and lasts for the next 6 months, most of the other members of the Big Four are going to openly oppose Wilson's 14 points. which makes sense because his 14 points address really what these countries want. Wilson wants to end empires. These countries wish to increase their empires. So Wilson's 14 points are essentially set aside. Now, some of the other countries are going to be left out of this conference. Russia, which made a separate peace with Germany, it will be kept out of the conference. Germany and Austria themselves will not be permitted to attend the conference or participate in any of the conversations. And other minor nations like Japan are going to be ignored. Again, the Big Four dominate this conference, and other nations who are there hoping to bring change to their part of the world are essentially going to be ignored and pushed aside. So after months of debate, we finally have a treaty that is signed on the 5th anniversary of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, June the 28th, 1919. So it's signed on the anniversary of the event that kicked off this war in the first place. And the treaty is far from perfect, and unfortunately creates an extremely harsh peace for Germany. So let's examine a little bit of this treaty and see what specifically is happening to Germany. Germany is forced to accept the war guilt clause, which means they have to accept the responsibility for starting the war and therefore take on the burden of everything that happened afterwards. Reparations will be paid by Germany to the Allied nations. In total, 33 billion American dollars will be paid out to the Allied powers. Germany's military will be crippled by the treaty. Their army will be limited to 100,000 men. They're to possess no airplanes, no submarines. Their navy is limited to 33 small ships. And the area of Western Germany known as the Rhineland along the Rhine River will be demilitarized, weakening Germany on its western border. The monarchy will be abolished. The Weimar Republic will be formed, and a new German government will be put in place now that the war is over. Germany will lose all of their overseas colonies and territories, including the lands that they won from Russia when Russia surrendered to Germany in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Portions of Germany itself will be ceded to other neighboring countries that will amount to about 10% of Germany's land. The area of Alsace-Lorraine will be returned to France, and the area of the Saar, a very coal-rich portion of Germany, will be run by the League of Nations. Germany will be prevented from forming any future alliances with Austria, and Germany will be occupied by Allied troops whilst this transition takes place. When Germany arrives at the Paris Peace Conference and they read the treaty, they are aghast. They have no idea that all of these things have been included in it because Germany, again, has been kept out of the conversation with this treaty, and Germany essentially has no choice but to accept the terms of this peace agreement. Even though the terms are harsh and terrible, Germany is at an extreme disadvantage as they have agreed to an unconditional surrender. And if Germany does not sign the treaty, then they face invasion by Allied forces and could potentially lose even more. This map shows the areas that have been ceded to other nations from the actual German nation itself. And this map shows how the map of Europe is going to be redrawn. So it's not just Germany that is going to be changed by the Treaty of Versailles, but also the Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires, which no longer exist, are going to be divided and new nations will be created. This is going to lead to a lot of problems down the road. So in terms of President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, the only part of his original plan that makes it into the final draft of the treaty is his League of Nations. And Wilson was extremely frustrated and angry during the process of writing this treaty, but believed that the League of Nations would eventually triumph and sort of solve all the world's problems. That as long as the League existed and was created, that it would prevent future wars, and that would be enough. That would be worth it. So Wilson returns home from Paris with the Treaty of Versailles, and according to the U.S. Constitution, the treaty still has to be ratified and approved by the United States Senate. So just because President Wilson signed the treaty doesn't mean that the United States is on board with this. Wilson must return, deliver the treaty to the United States Senate, and the Senate must vote to approve this treaty. And that's going to lead us into some problems because the United States Senate is not happy with this draft of the treaty or with the League of Nations. And in terms of the treaty itself, Field Marshal Ferdinand Foch, a hero of the war for the French, said this is not a peace. It is an armistice for 20 years. And David Lloyd George said we shall have to fight another war again in 25 years' time. And they're absolutely correct. World War II will begin a mere 20 years later in 1939, with the Treaty of Versailles as a primary focus of the reasons for the start of the war. So to take a look at the standard that we introduced at the beginning of the lesson, the United States pursued efforts to maintain world peace. So President Wilson attended the Paris Peace Conference with the idea of creating a system around this League of Nations that would lead to world peace. As we move forward, though, there will be a really intense debate over the ratification of this treaty and America's membership in the League of Nations. And that's going to be the first major step in pushing America into a more isolationist period where they avoid getting involved in international affairs. So some key takeaways from this video lesson. The Paris Peace Conference was held to write a treaty to officially end World War I. The Big Four, England, France, and Italy, and the United States dominated the conference, and other nations were pushed aside. European nations like France and England wanted a harsh peace for Germany, while President Wilson proposed his 14 points, which were ways to avoid future wars and create an international peacekeeping body. The treaty that will be written will create a harsh peace for Germany and her allies, redrawing the map of Europe and setting us up for problems about 20 years down the road. And the League of Nations is Wilson's only contribution to the Treaty of Versailles from his original 14 points. Thanks for watching this video lesson. I hope you learned something.